the cloud. Just to reassure you that when you're in breakout rooms having conversations, nothing gets recorded. So it's only in this main space that things are going to be recorded. So what we're aiming to do today is to learn a bit more about life and challenges for Afghan residents in bridging hotels, to raise awareness about how trauma and lack of education can affect people participating in workshops. The idea is that most people here on the call are planning to run some of the workshops from the welcome workshop package that the Home Office is sending out across the country. And we're going to look at some strategies to create the best possible experience for participants, given the fact that people are carrying a lot of trauma and stress, and some people have never been in a classroom before, held a pen, or done anything similar. So hopefully that's going to be helpful. Just checking with Shahrazad. Excuse me a moment.
I can't hear you, Jazz.
So once again, I'm sorry about that. The text, I thought the first time we do this, it's almost inevitable. The text slightly unseating us. So our guest speaker is trying to join the call, and I'm just helping her there to signpost to how to get in. But in the meantime, we'll go with here. So what we're going to do is hear from Shahrazad, who's one of my colleagues on the Bright Path Futures project. The project is very much designed to be led by Afghans, developed by Afghans, and delivered by Afghans. And so Shahrazad and my colleague Monir are really instrumental in most of the work we're doing. And she's going to share a bit about life in the hotel and what it's like to be in that space. We're going to talk about practical things to consider when you're running a workshop, some of the things we've learned from each other as we've experimented and tried stuff out. We're going to talk a bit about safeguarding considerations. I'm kind of assuming most people on the call will know quite a bit about that already, so we're not going to be spending a lot of time on that, but just covering off some key points to keep that surfaced in our minds. And we're going to then look at understanding and responding to trauma and the impact of trauma on people participating in the sort of sessions that you're going to be running. So while we're waiting for Shahrazad to join us, I'm going to skip ahead and also to invite people on the call. It'd be really helpful if you could just put in the chat a bit about your role, your context, and what you'd like from this session, so that we can be looking at that and just checking and making sure we're meeting people's needs as we go. That would be very helpful if that's possible. And for those people who've done that already, thank you very much. Now, the first thing I want to say, if I can get rid of the chat, there we are, is as people who are experienced with running sessions probably know this already. It's a bit of an obvious point, but it is easy to overlook. You go into a session, particularly one when there's a lot of information to share, and the slides that you'll be getting through from the welcome workshop set, there is a lot of information on those slides, and we can be so warmed up and kind of ready to get that great information out to our audience. Sometimes we forget to pause and think a bit about what it's like from their point of view. And I've done this so many times myself. I feel I'm learning from my own experience here, where I've got in the room, I thought I'm ready to go, you know, the running order's great, it all makes sense to me. And then I realize I've neglected to think some great big obvious thing about them and their experience and their starting point, which has a massive bearing on what we do, what we say, how we say it. So I guess this session, if anything, is a chance to help us together start to really think a bit about what it's like to be the people who will be in the workshop and the participants, and ways we can make that as positive an experience for them as possible, given how much information there is to share, and how much of that you're likely to be preoccupied with when you're running sessions. We'll come back to Shahrazad once we've got her. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the practical strategies that we've developed, and trial and error, really, sort of having a go at things and seeing what works and what doesn't. And particularly because the workshops we run have been designed by people from Afghanistan who've got a really good understanding of the sort of cultural drivers and what makes things go well. So the first thing I say is that in Afghanistan, apparently, now you're not hearing from the expert here, of course, but someone who's learned it secondhand. In Afghanistan, when you have a group session or a workshop or anything like that, you always do the first thing first, which is you have a bit of a reading from the Quran and people are quiet and they sort of reflect on that, and then they kind of together, and then you spend a bit of time just chatting and getting to know people and asking how they're doing and maybe asking about the families. Or it's very important to have that sort of bit of social connection time and human time together before you get to the topic of what it is you're there to discover and to discuss. So you might or might not want to do something like that, but knowing that's what people are used to could be helpful. The other thing to think about potentially is what's the first thing people are going to experience when they come into the room. And the kind of training and facilitation I do is called creative action methods. We have a concept called warm up, which is really important to us. And it's not about icebreakers or activities. It's much more about state and the state of mind that we're in. So how I am as I come into the space and what I do will very much be an unconscious invitation to participants as how I want them to be and what I want them to do. So for example, and this is again really obvious and a lot of people think, yes, we know this already, but I'm just going to go through some of the basics. How you lay out the space. You know, if we have rows of chairs like conference style, you're kind of inviting people to be quite passive. If you have big tables and big groups, you're likely to have one or two dominant voices in group work discussion. If you can have smaller tables with smaller groups, more people get to speak, more people get to join in. When people come in, it's really useful to have somebody, preferably someone who speaks their language, to welcome them and make them feel welcome and smile. And also to help if people don't know each other already, good chance they will, but if they're mixing through, introductions and names, just encouraging people to kind of get to know each other's names is a really good way of kind of helping people to feel like it's their space. You may already have had this experience. I certainly have. Whenever I've visited people in a hotel or been invited in, it seems to be very important that you have slices of fruit and some nuts and some cake and dishes and maybe some juice. And that's very much part of the welcome. It's a cultural signifier of this is a space where it's very friendly and we want you to come in. So these are quite simple things that you can do, particularly in the first event that you run or the first workshop, to give that signal of this is a very hospitable space. And finally, just learning a couple of phrases in Dari. Most of you know already, salam alaikum, how do you say hello? And nomet chist, what's your name, is a good one. And that's a sort of, it's our space together, you know, that you're welcome here and your language is valued, even if you just got a couple of short phrases. So I'm going to carry on giving a little bit of information. So I've got this bit about first experiences. There's a few more slides, and then I'm going to invite people to go into breakout rooms and have a debrief with a couple of other people to see which of these things feels useful to you, which you might want to remember and act on, and any other things that you do yourselves that I haven't mentioned. So if you want to note down stuff as I'm saying it that you can take into that discussion, please feel free. It won't be just me talking. So the next thing to consider is building trust. Again, this is really obvious, but the simple stuff is often what makes the difference. I've been working with women from Afghanistan as a teacher for the last 4 months. So I've got to know them people pretty well, and also wider families and communities. And I'm just constantly experiencing a level of warmth and openness and emotional availability, which sometimes I think we have a reputation, don't we, culturally in the UK, of being a little bit reserved or a bit more cautious before we get to know people. And I've talked about that difference with my colleagues and been given that feedback of actually it's very helpful to just not be afraid to be human, to smile, to be warm, to show that you kind of have those feelings, because that's what people are used to and that's what they'll expect. Eye contact is much more direct in Afghanistan. There's that kind of sense of we make that quick connection potentially. Another way of building trust, which is I use with all the groups I ran, this is not culturally specific, is just to create simple agreements at the beginning. Now, why this safety is important, to come back to the topic of this workshop, is that if people have experienced stress, trauma, if they're coming into the space and they've never been in a learning situation before, feeling safe is going to mean that they can start to learn. You know, you can relax if you feel safe, you can take stuff in. So thinking about safety and emotional safety is really very useful. There are 3 things I invite people to do when I start a session. One is to be kind and supportive to yourself and to other people. So if you need a drink of water, get a drink of water. If you need a bit of a brain break, have one. And that's particularly useful with trauma and stress in view, that people will struggle to concentrate more, they will be tireder, it will feel like more hard work for them. So encouraging self-care is really helpful. Confidentiality is really important thing to request because people are sharing personal stories, but also to point out that we can't guarantee confidentiality. So people need to bear that in mind when they are sharing their own experiences and know that. And then the third thing is, and this is really the most important one, you don't have to do it if you don't want to. So everyone has different levels of comfort zone, and encouraging people to notice what they're comfortable with and what they're not, and to opt out when they need to, means they can relax a little bit. They're not going to feel under performance pressure in maybe the way that they might do. So those are the 3 things: kind, confidential, and you can opt out, which I think help create that emotional safety. The literacy barriers element, if you can't read and write in your own language or in English, then you've usually got a really well-developed set of skills in oral recall and memory, because that's what you've traded on all your life. Your shopping list in your head is not written down. So you can rely on people being able to keep and store information. But when you've got a lot of information, and it's new information, and it's potentially quite disorientating and confusing because a lot of things that you'll be presenting are quite new, it can get really difficult to hold everything, and you can't take notes. That's not so easy. You won't be able to look at the PowerPoint afterwards and reread it because that's not available to you as a skill. So these are some strategies that you can think about to help people with recall and with holding on to the information that you're sharing if they're not able to make notes. So one thing is making sure there's plenty of discussion time. If I've talked about something, I'm much more likely to remember it if I've processed it, if I've made it my own, than if I've just listened. And I'm aware of the irony right now that I'm talking a lot and you're not having much chance to process. So we'll get to that shortly. You want to really reinforce the big takeaway messages so they don't get lost. What are the big ones? What do you want them to remember in 6 weeks' time? Come back to those, mention them more than once, maybe more than twice, so that they get held on to. Encourage if you're not a first language speaker and you're not doing it in first language, then encourage your person that you're working with to interpret, to build on the message, because they'll understand where a literal translation isn't going to make much sense. It makes sense to us, but if you kind of just use the same words or the same phrases, people will be left a bit cold. And so if they know to help contextualize or give an example or explain in a different way, rather than just to be a language interpreter, that will help people with their recall, because it will make more sense to them. I use a lot of body language, I use mime, and I use stories, because these are all ways of getting visual recall and making association between a point. So if you're talking about something that is not useful, you can actually mime throwing it out of the room and say, this isn't something we want here, goodbye, for example. Or you can pull a bit of a silly face if it's a tricky point, and people will understand that, and they'll have an emotional memory then associated with what you're talking about, which is a little bit different to just a cognitive memory, the part of the brain that stores information at a cognitive level rather than in a more sort of whole body emotional level. Stories do the same thing. We're hardwired as storytellers. So any examples you can bring in will actually take the information directly into a different pit of people's brains. It will be stored in a different way because they'll respond from a different place. So that's really helpful if you've just got an example or you can share of something you're talking about, or somebody else can. And the last thing is to build on the foundation of people's known and what's already a very solid platform for them, which in the case of most people from Afghanistan, not all people, is Islamic teaching and practice. So we're producing some quotes from the Quran which relate quite closely to some of the points we're wanting to land. If you have an opportunity to do that, or if your interpreter does, then certainly do that, or just sort of bring it back to, if possible, because it will really make people feel reassured, and it will make it much more sense to them then, if that's something you're able to do. If you can't, no problem, of course. Then the last thing I want to talk about is downsizing fear, when we've gone in to do workshops which are quite interactive and guided by people's questions, we've become aware that a lot of residents and hotels have really kind of exaggerated ideas about what happens in the UK. You know, if I argue with my wife, she's going to just be taken away and put to live somewhere else. Or, you know, if this happens, I tell my children off too harshly, they'll be taken away from me straight away. And rumor and gossip and all of these things, that sort of stuff, information shoots around in all directions. And of course, it's very hard to know what to trust, you know, if you don't have a trusted information source. So wherever possible, while you're giving information, being able to downsize and right size misconceptions and reassure people, and kind of that systems are there to support them, to help, that the statutory services and the early help teams are just really useful to give support where parenting might be difficult, for example, and make that a very positive kind of association rather than a big scary one, is very, very helpful. Because when people are scared, they don't learn. When they feel safe, they take in information. And of course, we want people to feel very safe in the UK, because that's what's going to make them feel confident to step out and integrate with the wider community. So I've given you lots of information to think about. I'm going to suggest now that we put people in breakout rooms, 3 together. So you've got a bit of talk time for 6 minutes. So you can just debrief on some of what you've heard, some of what you know that I haven't mentioned that you can share with each other. And then we'll bring people back in and we'll share a little bit from some of those conversations. Alex, I think you're going to be the breakout room guru. So if you've not had this experience before, it's very magical. You'll get something will come up on the screen inviting you to join breakout room 1 or 2. You press accept and you will magically fly through cyberspace and land in that room with 2 random people. So you can meet some new people as well. Enjoy yourselves, have fun, and we'll see you back shortly.
Okay, breakout room should have opened now. So if you just accept the invite, fingers crossed.
Oh, Shahzad's here. That's great, Shahzad. Let's see if we can get your audio going.
Thank you all so much for joining and being here today. I'm Shahzad. I was evacuated with my family on 19th August. As all you can imagine, it's a very, very hard journey for all the Afghans. I came to the UK 2 months ago, but for people who came to the UK on August and have been around 6 months, that they're in the British hotels, there are a lot of challenges that they're facing. For example, starting from the basic, needs of life, such as having a good room, a good house, somewhere they could belong, feel like they belong to. And that was lacking. They have a problem with those space. For example, some women have 5, 6 toddlers and they're staying with her all day long and they have to take care of the kids. So that's an issue for them. And also like being able to adapt to the changes that they're facing on top of the trauma they had while getting evacuated. It's also a big issue. So as you can imagine, living in a country that's like war torn is already hard enough. We've seen a lot, we've been through a lot.
Shahzad, I'm going to pause again just to say that the noise is.
Okay, I'm outside. Yeah. So as you guys know, it's already very traumatic to live in a war torn country. But on top of that, for the Taliban to take over this quickly and for us to be evacuated in the manner that we were evacuated, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of trauma, a lot of emotions and unprocessed emotions. And especially the fact that not a lot of people in Afghanistan actually know about these, feelings and emotions, and talking about it to people and actually acknowledging that they're feeling depressed, just like brushing it off. Like mental health is not like very common to talk about. So to feel all that, like, and being buried by those emotions, I feel like we have that issue. So that's one aspect of things. And then the other aspect of it is the cultural shock that people are facing right now. So I know of women and men who are here who didn't know anything about the Western world, who just came from like a village in Afghanistan and are now seeing like a totally different aspect of life here. Something as simple as like the cash system.
because we have cash system in Afghanistan, and so for them to come to the bank systems here using cards instead of cash, speaking a different language that they're not particularly very good at or don't even know, so it's very hard to adjust to that. And also some women who are literate, who want to work, are finding it hard to adapt, but also those who don't even know basic stuff, who are just in their room all day long, having to take care of their family members. It's a lot of trauma for them. So I just wanted to explain the literacy side of things. I want you guys to picture somebody who is coming from Afghanistan, who is not even literate enough in their own language. When they enter a classroom with all that pressure, all that trauma of having, for example, family left behind, or having difficulties to adjust to the system and the culture here, and then for them to enter a classroom with all the PowerPoints, all the technology, all the notebooks and books, and trying to learn a new language, it could be very intimidating, but also very exciting, I think. So when you deal with somebody like that, I think we all have to keep that in mind, that it's not just a student coming here in the classroom, normal student who has been through this before, but somebody who is traumatized, somebody who has financial issues, somebody who has left his whole life behind to come to this country for a better life. So I think that's a really important aspect to consider. Yeah, and Josh, do you want me to add anything else? Because my mind is everywhere right now.
I'm not surprised. I think you're doing amazingly well, being able to explain things to us while you're having to walk around outside just to find some space. And I think this really illustrates the point we're trying to make, doesn't it? That, even in this context, a training context, just lack of physical space, lack of space to study, lack of space to process, lack of space to think is a really huge issue. And we're providing those spaces in our workshops. What we're doing is setting up room and time for people to sit and talk and be shared with and to share in their turn. So it's quite precious, it's very valuable space and time, and for us to kind of respect that and validate it the way that people will coming into the space, I think is really important. I think you've done a pretty good job giving us an overview there. What I was wondering is if anybody would like to ask you any questions, because this is quite a unique opportunity. Often we have things we'd like to ask or like to know, but feel a bit awkward. Is it okay to ask that? Is it going to be too triggering for that person, or culturally inappropriate, or do I look a bit silly? But in this, which is a learning space together, I'm pretty sure you're happy to be asked most questions. I'm guessing that obviously appropriate questions. So now's your chance. If you'd like to just unpick any of that or get a bit more of an insight into what it's like or what would be helpful or stuff we need to learn, please ask now. And there's sometimes that thing about being the first as well. So have a think about, if I was going to ask a question, what question would I ask? And then maybe get us started with that question, if anybody would like to.
Well, I might just bring up something that Sandra mentioned today about the lady that I'm going to be teaching. She was saying that she thinks she doesn't go out perhaps very much. And
so is this question for me? Because I'm not aware of the background, but because I wasn't here in the first part. So the lady we're talking about, can you please give me a quick background on her?
Sandra,
That's a really interesting.
Could you recap the question for the recording? Because I'm not going to record people asking the question, because I think that's a little bit, we keep that private. But if you could just recap the question before you answer, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, so there's an expecting lady who's at her home. She just moved in December, and she doesn't. The question is, should we encourage her to go outside more often, or is it too much? So there could be many factors to this. We don't know the family background. We don't know about, I personally don't know if she's literate or not, if she speaks enough English to be able to communicate when she goes out, or if her husband or family is okay with her going out, because sometimes families could be restrictive. I know people in my bridging hotel who are not allowed, so to say, or encouraged by their husbands to go out just in the dining room to eat, among other men. They just don't feel okay with that. So it all depends. But if you feel like talking to her and, understanding her side of the story and what she wants, if she's okay with going out, and for her to like take maybe small walks during the day, it's good for her mental health as well as physical health for her baby. I feel like that's the best way. If she can communicate with you and you could ask her if she's comfortable with telling you, I think that would be the best.
I'm going to just come in as
Thank you.
well, because we've done quite a bit of work with the families in our hotel on this question, and I've spoken to my colleagues, to Monir and Tahmina, a lot about it. So they're not here, but I'm going to share on some of what I've learned from them. And what we've done is worked very much with husband and wife on this question, and really been able to kind of put the positive points about somebody getting a bit more confidence to go outside or to get more independent. So sort of understanding that going to school, for example, or being able to take the child to nursery, and not everything having to fall on the husband's shoulders. If he wants to work to earn money, then it's going to be really helpful for the family if his wife is able to do some of those things. Otherwise, he won't be able to get a job. And I think understanding that in the UK, life is very different. We use the metaphor of the lemon tree, and we say, okay, you've got a lemon tree in your country, it will thrive. Bring it to the UK, and left outside, it will die. But if you put it in around glass and you give it special conditions, it can thrive. You don't have to change everything, but you do have to change a bit to make sure that how you function still works in this new place. And that kind of way of looking at things like a story or an image can be really helpful to people to just start to think, what's normal back there? What might my new normal be, without feeling a pressure to change, but an invitation to think about how change might support the family as a whole. Because I can guarantee you, I think I can say this confidently, having worked a lot with the women, they won't do it unless the husbands are supportive. They just won't. If the husband is like, I'm reluctant or I don't want it, it just doesn't happen. So it's very much hearts and minds from everybody involved to help move those things forward, and not getting a situation where you're accidentally setting one person against another, or making people feel awkward with that. Do you think that's a fair comment, Shahrazad, what I'm saying?
Yes, I completely agree, because some women, even if they feel like it, they wouldn't do it just from the fear of their husbands leaving them, especially if she's expecting and she doesn't want to do anything against her, husband's wishes. And some men are just not comfortable with their woman being seen by other men or other people. So that's a big factor, yeah.
Another thing on this question that was being shared with us is that people are really frightened of racist abuse. So they're really frightened that if women go outside wearing a hijab, that they're going to be abused for wearing the hijab, or kind of given because they look different and they're very visibly different. Is it safe for my wife to go outside, for my sister to go outside, for my daughter to go outside? Will there be the sense of being protected and being really taken care of is very, very strong. And so that reassurance of it will be safe, and this is what you can go with somebody who's a trusted person, and people outside will help if something goes wrong. That's the sort of the right sizing I was talking about earlier, really, of de-escalating that fear, because it's a very reasonable fear if you don't know what to expect and it's new. You're better to err on the side of caution. How will you know? That's the other thing we've picked up on. That was a brilliant question. Any more for any more? Jane, you went first. Who would you like to hear from? Let's check in with somebody and see what they're thinking, because it's a small group, so we can do that, and I'll stop the recording.
So, as far as I know, in our Afghan society, for those who are very I feel like insecure and possessive, and they don't know much about their religion, and they just like to use bits and pieces of the sayings of the Prophet or the Quranic verses to use it for their own benefit. So to say, like, the insecure men, they are more of the controlling people. But we also have husbands who are very open-minded, like my colleague Munir and her wife, who both are educated and supportive of each other. So it really depends on the family and the kind of mindset they have and the kind of people they are. So I cannot we cannot generalize it. But if you talk about a conservative family with conservative mindsets who are like religious, because I'm religious too, but I have 2 degrees and I work, and if I get married, I'll get married to an Afghan guy or whatever the nationality is, somebody who is open-minded. So I feel like people who use religion against women not being able to going out there or studying or just living their life the way they want to. I think that's an issue. So it really depends on the type of people we're dealing with. But for the majority of the people who are in our hotel, they're, I would say, very conservative and close-minded, because just like I mentioned, they wouldn't even allow their wives to to come and like sit and eat with them, because they fear that other men will see them, or they will see other women, other men, and they'll get encouraged to talk to them, and they'll they say their eyes would become white. We have a saying which means they will see the world, and they won't think their husbands are good enough anymore, and they fear sometimes of what if she leaves me, what if she doesn't listen to me, what if she doesn't obey me anymore. So it really depends on the person, I think. But we also, like I said, on the other side of the things, we have supportive people too who are educated and open-minded. So just like I said, it depends on the person and the family.
So I'm going to share a little as well, because what we've seen is quite a lot of change in the family dynamics in the families that we're part of the community. And that's very much been on the back of the workshops that were run in our area by the Red Cross, and they ran some really excellent workshops with the men and women separately. And that was really important, because men had a chance to process as a group, and the women had a chance to process as a group with the same information. A lot of this is about peer pressure and being seen to be doing the right thing. So influence among peers is really, really big. And at a certain point, we had somebody who was a bit of a sort of a ne'er-do-well, actually, got in trouble on the aeroplane and sort of in trouble at the airport. It was sending messages to the men in our hotel going, look, you shouldn't let your daughters go to school. You shouldn't do this. It's really against the Quran. And people were listening. People in Afghanistan do listen to advice, and this is my experience, that people kind of really want to know what's the general view on something. And conversely, they were listening when Munir was sort of actually modeling a different way of doing things. And when we were doing it in the workshops, they had a chance to think about it. So now when we ask women in our group, what's the biggest difference? The first thing is they speak English and read and write English. They'd never held a pen before. They could never write their names, never been to school. Big change, big empowerment. Second thing, our husbands treat us differently. They respect us. They listen to us. And that's in 4 months. So it clearly is really possible for groups of conservative families to make that journey. The how you make that journey is very much what we're addressing in the workshops that we're going to be offering in hotels, of giving people a chance to think about for themselves in a safe space why there's an advantage to making the shift. You've got to sell something. And also through language. So when I'm teaching, I teach can and shall, and we really make a difference between can I go shopping and shall I go shopping. Which one do you say to your husband? It's can I go shopping? Okay. In the UK, I would say to my husband, shall I go shopping? And just through a very simple language teaching point, I'm sort of dropping in that the language makes the difference. And then we can have a bit of a conversation about that. Oh, well, that's interesting. Well, if I did that, and we're starting to think a little bit, and it's just opening those doors and planting seeds. The women are very interested, but they need to make sure the men are on board at the same time, and then everybody makes the journey together. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's been our experience.
Are all your sessions delivered separately, so men's groups and women's groups?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are, because we find that the women are much, much more relaxed and feel much more able and free to speak out. They just feel really shy and closed down if men are there listening, and they've said, we don't want men around it, we don't feel comfortable. So we're respecting really what's been requested. And for the men likewise, they kind of just, that's what they know, is that kind of sense of being together with my brothers or with my sisters. That's how they would think about it, I think, or do think about it. Don't know if you agree, Shahrazad. We haven't tried it another way, so I'd be fascinated to try it. And I've heard really great feedback about mixed sessions. So I'm not.
Yeah, we've done mixed sessions for the UKRS.
Yeah, it's just not what we've done ourselves. But I think
one step at a time. If we do like separate sessions and then eventually make it mixed, if they're comfortable with it.
I think it also depends on the topic. When we're talking about gender equality, then it's a pretty tricky topic, and that's maybe a bit of an easier one to do separately, whereas other topics are less controversial and perhaps a bit easier to run with mixed groups. But I'm hypothesizing. So have we got any more questions? And if not, I'll move us on to the next bit of content. I'm not surprised we've come into that territory of gender equality, because it's such a big one for everybody. Okay, so let's move on back to Il PowerPointio. I'm going to grab it and move it down if I can. There we go. So I'm going to stop being able to see everybody again now. So I apologise for that. It's a bit of an odd situation here. Because once I share, all I can see is the share screen as well. Excuse me. No, that's not going to work. And share screen. There we go. Okay. So we've talked about literacy. We've talked about how literacy can be a really kind of make things very magical. If you've never done it before and it's the first time, it's like, whoa, this is amazing. And also it can be very intimidating. And it's really important to think about recall and how people are going to hold on to information. We're going to talk more about trauma shortly. But first, I want to take us through briefly some safeguarding considerations, which I'm sure most people have trained in, but it's good to kind of keep this live. So particularly tricky, triggering when we're in trauma territory, you know, we're talking about things we have no idea what stories people bring into the room with them. We don't know how what they hear is going to affect them. So if you see somebody leaving the room or getting upset, have someone on hand who's able, as a native speaker preferably, to be brief, to go out and just check, you know, like, are you doing all right? Or you needed the loo, no problem. But, you know, we don't want people out alone and distressed. It's really important that they feel taken care of. Really good idea to think about what your referral routes are and who you would refer to if something is disclosed, because you don't want to be trying to work that out in the moment. You know, have a bit of an idea of who are the people in your area that support people in domestic violence situations. Have you got charities? It's so different picture across the country. If you don't already, then know that before you get started on anything, in case people pop up with stuff or it becomes clear. And also just remembering that if you've been a victim of an abuse situation or trauma, it's much harder to, often, not always, to boundary and get that appropriate disclosure. You know, it often spills out in places where other people are listening. So we take care of people by, if that happens, very gently pressing a pause button or putting some brackets and finding that time, break time, lunch time, just outside the room, to help somebody share in an appropriate way with one other person or two other people, and not with everybody listening. Make sure that everybody's trained in safeguarding, basic but important. And remember that if adults are talking about conflict in a family between husband and wife, then the kids are likely to be affected, even though that might not be in first view for the people talking about the issue. And also, if you think somebody needs support and you know where to send them to and you can give them the contact details, the chances are they won't go. It's a huge journey to get out of a sort of professional training space or a support conversation and get through the door to the next thing. So who's going to help them get there? How are they going to be accompanied? Who's going to kind of get them in and safely land them so that they really feel they can access the support that's on offer? I've been in a teaching situation where people have asked me, you know, how do I get hold of contraception, or how do I sort of other difficult things? And I can say, well, go to the doctor, but they don't, you know, they need help to know. It takes a lot of confidence to be able to make those journeys. And you really need to kind of check with people. Do you want some support? Would it be helpful if I helped you get there? They might not, that's fine too, but at least they have a choice. If you don't really know how to respond to questions around domestic violence or abuse situations or any other things which are difficult, tricky issues, you know, painful, traumatic, people just disclosing trauma in terms of what's happened to them in Afghanistan, you know, the historic trauma, people just being incredibly distressed about the situation with their families currently. There's all sorts of reasons why people might come to pieces and have unmanageable distress. So if you're not sure what to do with that, there's lots of people in all of our parts of the country who do know that stuff and are really good at it. So just go and find one of them and check in and say, okay, what would you do in this situation? And then you've got the support. So if we're supported well and we hold ourselves well, we can hold other people better in our turn. And making sure we put that support in place in anticipation is quite useful. The final thing, which again, anyone with safeguarding background will know this, but I'm going to mention it again. When you talk about confidentiality as one of your ground rules or agreements, it's important to say to people, the rider, unless somebody's at risk, if somebody's at risk, then I'll be passing that information on, because I have a duty to protect people and children and vulnerable adults. If you've said that in advance, you've managed that expectation and people are disclosing accordingly. If you forget to say it and someone discloses, then they've told you without knowing that's true, and that's put them potentially in a very difficult position. So it's really important to just make people aware of how these things work here in this country and what the law says. You don't need to mention the law particularly, that gets a bit complicated, but that is our professional obligation. So that's a bit about safeguarding. Before I move on, does anyone have any questions about safeguarding related issues? I'm sort of skipping through this a bit quicker because I think most people know it, but just give people an opportunity if they do. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Alex now, and she's going to talk a bit about trauma and how that impacts on learning.
Okay, thanks, Joes. Thanks very much to Shahzad as well. I think it was really useful to hear directly from her as well. Just to quickly introduce myself. So I'm working with Joes. I'm based at Leicester University, and my background is in English teaching, but I've been doing some research into trauma-informed pedagogy for refugees. So I'm going to talk through the trauma bit today. So we know that many individuals who have refugee backgrounds are going to have experienced traumatic events. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what trauma is, how it can affect people, and how we might use certain strategies to help. So trauma can be defined as an emotional response to a terrible event, and we know that many of our service users who have come from Afghanistan have gone through horrible things. So it can lead to things like unpredictable emotions, flashbacks. It can put strain on relationships. There can be lots of physical symptoms like headaches, even backaches that people are left with as a result. And it negatively affects three main areas of the brain. So one of them is the prefrontal cortex, and that's the part which affects rational thinking. It can lead to unregulated fear responses, so kind of like a fight or flight mode. And then there's the hippocampus, which is also affected, and so that is responsible for memory and the ability to differentiate between past or present. So this is where the flashbacks can be experienced in the present, and people feel like the event is actually happening again. And then the last area that is affected is called the amygdala. And so this is the part which is kind of wired for survival. And this becomes more hyperactive in people who have PTSD. So those are the main areas which are affected. Jose, could you move on to the next slide, please? Okay, and so in terms of how people's behaviour or kind of daily experiences might be affected, and there's lots of different ways. So for example, there's avoidance behaviours, for example, avoiding thinking about the trauma, talking about the trauma, avoiding places, activities, maybe avoiding certain people. So that's to try and kind of insulate themselves against having to re-experience something or having something triggered. So I mentioned flashbacks as well. There might be like negative mood, negative thinking, also being vigilant or on guard. So that's the adrenaline response. Sometimes also loss of interest in things that people used to be interested in before, and problems with sleeping, which never helps. Okay, Joyce, could you move to the next one, please? Okay, so we are now going to think about how we might go about working with individuals who have experienced trauma. Could you click again, please, Joyce? And okay, yeah. So so there are different kind of key principles in trauma-informed practice. So one of them is to try to help people reduce their daily environmental stresses. So it's not only the traumatic experiences that people have been through that can affect them, but it's also the daily kind of nitty-gritty things, the difficulties that people are facing every day. So this might be things like, you know, trying to adjust to a new culture, trying to learn the language, for example, trying to sort out medical conditions and work out how things work over here. So there's lots of different possible stressors. So one thing that we can do is to try to help people by giving them some of the language for their daily needs, like practical things like going to see the doctor, for example. Other things like understanding the reasons why people might be late or absent. So as we saw before, there are avoidance behaviours are kind of quite typical in people who've experienced trauma. So people might be late or absent to a session for those reasons. Also, we saw that people might be suffering from insomnia, and there's lots of different actual trauma behaviours which might lead to things like lateness or absence. So I suppose if we're aware of that, then we can be a bit more forgiving and perhaps a bit more flexible with people, which can help to help them to feel less anxious about these things. Joe's already mentioned referral to suitable agencies, so that's really important. When we're working with people with complex needs, it's really important to know that we can't possibly deal with all of this ourselves, and we need to have referral pathways in place. And also just sharing key information, giving people choices. So sharing, for example, sharing information about how the education system works here, maybe for themselves, maybe for their kids, and so that people know what choices they have, and they can employ some agency in making those. Okay, Jose, thanks. Okay, another really important thing in trauma-informed practice is this idea of creating a safe space. So kind of giving them opportunities to build peer friendships within the group. Also giving them the choice of opting out of certain activities if they feel more comfortable doing so, and also letting them know that they should never feel obliged to share information that they don't feel comfortable sharing. So that is a sort of thing that we can make clear to people right from the beginning, so that they never feel kind of put on the spot or kind of railroaded into saying something they don't want to say or doing something they don't want to do. So again, that links to the idea of giving people some agency back. Physical space. So there's lots of things we can do to make the physical space feel safe, such as, you know, making sure there are no physical hazards, but also things like making sure there's clear access to the door. So some trauma survivors might prefer to sit next to a door, for example. Also making sure there's plenty of light in the room as well. So and also just making sure the room feels like a welcoming space as well, physically. Confidentiality, I think Jose has covered that one already. Routine and structure is an important one. So coming at this from the perspective of a teacher, so when I'm running a class, I would try to have a similar sort of routine or lesson structure each time, and to kind of let people know in advance what to expect from that class. And if you do that, it helps people feel like something in their lives is predictable, which can be very helpful for trauma survivors. So yeah, so trust grows from experience over time. So so giving people, kind of easing people in to relationship building and to feel like bad things are not going to happen in the session. And then slowly people will begin to trust you, to trust others in the room, to trust the process. To be sensitive in tricky conversations. So yeah, as we saw, it's possible that that trauma survivors might find certain topics challenging, for example. So we need to remain vigilant, and we need to make sure that we keep giving people choices and not and helping people feel like they don't have to talk about things that they don't want to talk about. Clear agreements and boundaries. This kind of relates to routine and structure. So for relationships and expectations to be kind of set beforehand, so that people know where the boundaries are. So things also, yeah, like warmth and appropriate humor and kindness. So the kind of human to human connection, which relates to the idea of trust and building friendships. So it's all of these things kind of combine to create a safe space. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Jose to talk about the solutions focused approach.
I'm back. Here I am again. So we're looking at psychologically informed environments very much. A lot of this is about sort of having that basis of something which is going to help people build psychological safety and resource. And solutions focused is part of a positive psychology suite of approaches. You may already be very familiar with it. It's a very simple concept that instead of getting drawn to the difficulty, the challenge, the problem, the obstacle, we turn and position ourselves to focus more on what's going well, on where things can already happen, on skills that people have in place, how we build on them, how we extend them, how we use them in different or new situations, so that people are getting a sense of hope, of optimism, and of yes, I can. Now, it's not about trying to ignore or pretend that things aren't difficult. You know, we're really not saying that. It's obviously when people have distress, it's very real, and we want to be present with that and quietly very supportive and compassionate. But helping people to kind of come to like, oh, you did that really well, or look what a great idea you've got there, and come back to that as the sort of thing that you leave with is really useful. So that sense of hope, that sense of optimism, that sense of possibility, who might you be in future? Where do you want to be? So the conversations you have are all framed with, why are we doing this? You know, where do you want to get to? How's this going to help you get to here? It's purposeful. We've got three key parts of ourselves that we're always developing for ourselves and others. It's the bit of us that can notice what's happening, the bit of us that has some wisdom about how to respond to it, and the bit of us that can make a choice. So when you're working and supporting in a workshop environment or one-to-one, consciously creating opportunities for people to notice, to choose, to access their wisdom, the solutions they already have, really important. So it's listen, not fix, you know, it's a coaching stance really of remembering you're not there as the one who's got to have all the answers. People have a lot of answers for themselves. They may not have access to them straight away, but a well-placed question and some time to think can get them there. And if they've come up with them for themselves, it will make sense to them and they're much more likely to do it. So that's the solutions focused kind of approach. Underpins these other aspects of working with trauma. So back to Alex.
Hi again. Okay, so the last main principle of trauma-informed pedagogy. Oh, I can hear some feedback. Is that coming from me? Okay, I think that's better now. Okay, so the last main area of trauma-informed practice is there are things that we can do to help to reduce people's trauma symptoms. So there are mental first aid strategies that we can use. There are plenty of different variations of this available, but one thing that we can do, for example, like if somebody's having a flashback or a panic attack, something like that, we can kind of encourage them to take deep breaths and keep calm. At the same time, we need to make sure that we're also keeping calm. And then kind of gradually make eye contact and approach somebody moving slowly towards them, and try to reorient them by saying their name and telling them that they're safe and reminding them who you are. And then gradually kind of increasing the sensory stimuli. So kind of speaking a bit more loudly, and then letting them know that, that you're going to touch them on the arm. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. And then basically bringing them back into the present moment and kind of grounding them. And there's lots of strategies on the Amico cards, which Jose might be able to talk about a little bit later. If we have time.
Alex, there isn't much later because we're nearly out of time, so I'm going to show you now if that's okay.
Okay.
These are sort of evidence-based things we can do, simple stuff to help ourselves stay well. We've translated these into Duddy, so I'll give you a kind of a view of a card up close. And this is the first pack printed. It came through the post today, so there we are. I'm happy to share that with you. We've got these packs going out to all of the hotel communities through the Home Office liaison officers, and we're having an online version which we can share, so you can get onto a website and have a look at them. So these are sort of self-access resources. There's a lot in here to help people stay well in their own language. So that's that. I'll go back to me.
Brilliant, thanks, Jose. Other things to bear in mind here. So to try to prevent a trauma symptom coming about in the first place, so to tread carefully around likely trauma triggers. So we know that for people who've experienced this type of trauma through forced migration, there's certain very sensitive topics for most people. Talking about family might be triggering. Talking about journeys might also be triggering. Talking about life back home or kind of somebody's childhood might also be triggering. So it's wise to kind of to tread very carefully around those sorts of topics. But actually, fundamentally, anything might serve as a trauma trigger. It might be something that we'd never thought about before. It might be somebody's tone of voice, or a smell, or somebody's body language. It could be anything. So it's just really important to just kind of keep our eyes open and just be prepared to be kind of responsive and flexible when it comes to that. If somebody is actually having a panic attack, or seems to be kind of unfocused or kind of dissociating, then there are certain grounding activities that you might want to suggest that they do. So grounding activities are basically anything which brings people back into the present moment, brings them back into their bodies, and are quite often multisensory. So kind of just getting someone to kind of feel the weight of their body in the chair, and to feel their feet on the floor, or getting them to clap, or to do something rhythmical, for example. Or to move, to get up, and sit down again. So those sorts of things can help to bring people back into their bodies again. And finally, so small regular goals and progress checks are also very useful, because lots of trauma survivors find it difficult to kind of to see incremental progress, that can have a kind of all or nothing mentality. So it's very useful to kind of to get them to set little goals and to see that they are progressing towards them, and that change is possible and progress is possible. So all of those things can help. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hand over to Jose, because I know we don't have much time left.
Oh, thank you, Alex. That's really helpful. Okay, so we're at the wrap-up stage. First of all, want to check if people have questions, mostly for Alex. I think at this point we've just been talking about the trauma piece, and then we'll move on to just getting some last thoughts and wrapping up. So I'm going to stop the share for a moment. There we are. Zoom back in the room. Ooh. Does anyone have any questions about trauma for Alex, our resident trauma expert? Okay, so I'm going to ask the same question I asked before. If you did have a question, what might it be? Let's see, because often the questions that we half ready to ask and don't quite ask are the ones that turn out to be really useful. And then if anyone can formulate that, let's pitch in and see what we get. So about putting this in context. So I think I'm going to get that you've had the information you need, and that's been really helpful. Thank you, Alex. It would be great at this point if it's possible to get people. I'm going to just stop recording now. I'll pause